So I'm out for a walk at night. It's not very windy. It's a little chilly. Hopefully there will not be too much mic noise. But I did want to record a bit about a couple of things that have been on my mind lately. It's funny how we use that language, on my mind, as if a mind is something like a table or a dish, and then we have things on it. Now, of course, we have all kinds of interesting hidden metaphors in English, in common English usage. They're all over the place. One of the funniest ones is, it's raining. But what is it? What is it that is raining? I guess raining is so pervasive that really perhaps what we mean is everything is raining. It's all raining. The whole thing is raining, except inside. And there are a lot of other metaphors. For example, the metaphor that a relationship is like a journey. And some of these metaphors are confusing and don't work very well. Many of them come from very old traditions and even from other languages. The metaphors are important because they influence how we think about and participate with the world. If I think my heart is a container, then I put things in it. In English, a discussion is often seen as a battle. An argument is a battle. Right? And it's important to remember the weird thing about metaphor. Metaphor tells us what things are. So it picks the categories and classes that we associate with their identities, including how they are distinguished from everything. In other words, in what ways. And also how they connect to or don't connect with other things. And most of the way we use language is like a knife in English. We use it to cut things apart, and the cuts are pretty crude, and the kind of cut we make in identity to be able to distinguish a key or a flower or a tree or a wheel. The cuts are very primitive. They're sharp, angled, not very connective shapes. And so in English, our view of identity, or how we metify identity in our minds and in our participation in the world, in the things that we do and don't do, and the reasons we do and don't do, all of these are deeply influenced by the metaphors in our language. There are two common tropes, though there are many tropes in English, and I'm more of a fan of rhetoric than I am an academic. But if I say my heart is a rose, I am making a metaphor. I don't say, it's not a simile, right? A simile is if I say, my heart is like a rose. Then I am saying some of the connotations that belong in our language and tradition and our personal lives to a rose, some of those connotations are transferred to my heart. So it could be imagined that my heart is delicate or red or has soft petals or a beautiful fragrance or grows on the end of a stem that has thorns, or is given in love as a gesture. These are connotations, right? These are the cuts that tell us what a rose is. A rose is first not everything, and then it is something, and then it is a plant that we think of that grows separately, and then it is a cultivar, we cultivate them. And then it has these kinds of leaves and these kinds of stem branchings and these kinds of flowers in these kinds of seasons, and then, it is an ornamental plant. This is the simple version of the cuts, right? To get from everything to something, you have to make distinctions. And those distinctions are like cuts. So all the things we think of are like this. They have, in cognition, a certain structure. And each of our connotation trees for each word is uniquely personal, even if it contains shared elements. Because Joe has had an experience of a rose that Tina has not had. Or vice versa. That made an impression on Joe or Tina, and so it remained connotated with the rose. If I've been bitten by a dog, dogs acquire the connotation can bite me unexpectedly. Though our connotation webs are very sophisticated and have near neighbors and distant neighbors, just as solar systems do. And the connotations that light up for us in any moment of conversation are also influenced by who we're with, where we are in our life path, what's going on around us, the last 7 things we saw that we noticed or made an impression on us. All of these things, they transform how we relate with cognition. The is word is a big problem for us. Because once we have a word, then we become confused between description and identity, between reference and participation. To refer to a tree is nothing like participating with the tree. Living in and as and with and for and around and in concert and harmony and learning with the tree. Most people don't even think of such a thing as plausible, let alone, practice it. And many people consider it to be impossible. They just think trees are, what we all think trees are. What we commonly think trees are. A big plant, woody, source of lumber. Can burn it for fire. When I tell you, those have nothing to do with what trees are. So our connotation webs have been damaged by modernity, the cultures we've grown up in, language, we all undergo enculturation as children, and over the span of our lives, it's ongoing. And then we also undergo enlanguaging, and these are imprinting processes. And they give us very specific arrays of tools, but they also give us very specific arrays of handicaps. Ancient languages are rich with tools. Modern languages are rich with handicaps. They are blunt, they are reductive, they are utilitarian. The metaphor sets are extremely limiting, and non-participatory. They're utilitarian. This is what you do with a that kind of thing. Which is unfortunate and something it would be wonderful to be able to amend. Perhaps we can amend it a little bit by thinking about it and learning about it together. So, obviously, that topic, a concept in our referential mind, it has a superficial kind of hard structure, which is denotations. A denotation is a definition, like you might find in a dictionary. What is a wheel, right? And then you'll find, somewhere between 3 and 15 senses. And each sense is its own definition. So our denotations, we pretty much know what we mean denotationally. If I say I will go to the car and point at the car, then, we don't need much connotation, though connotation's involved. I have associations with the idea of a car, just as I do a tree, an animal, my foot. And the connotations change, again, depending on what I'm doing, the last few things I was exposed to. That's one of the most surprising things. Humans are sequence-based animals, and so people can take advantage of this, actually. Darren Brown's one of them. What we've most recently been exposed to transforms how we interpret what's going on right now and how we are in the web of identity. And how we are in the difference between referring to things so that they can be utilized and participating with them or acquiring sensitive intimacy with them. And obviously I'm a big fan of the sensitive intimacy practice. And I think it would be wonderful if we could help each other learn to practice this again together, at least more of the time than we usually do. So yes, what we've recently been exposed to affects how we interpret what we next see. All of our interpretive faculties are primed by sequences. And most of the sequences are casual. Walking down the street, there's a stone rabbit, here's someone's lawn, there's a fire hydrant, people's cars are parked around me, I can see the stars. But in our modern daily lives, we're being sequenced. We're being particularly programmed. Someone is controlling the sequence of denotations, connotations, in a way that's almost like the opposite of a dream, where instead of consciousness exploring its capacity to invent worlds, tiny little snippets of representational worlds are presented in sequence via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and so on. And this is a catastrophic development for human cognition in general, for human intelligence, and for our imaginations. I think it wouldn't be wrong to compare it to circumcising our consciousness or amputating organs of our participatory imagination and replacing them with tiny little limbic reward or punishment sequences that are highly addictive but empty of meaning, which isn't to say that all online communication is like that. But rather the vast majority is, and the most compelling surface of it is, much like our language in English, much like the terrible impoverishments that most of us suffer. Many of us suffer, nearly all of us suffer somewhat. We suffer it uniquely. So, I remember talking with a cab driver in San Francisco once, and he was talking about the kids in the projects, and he said, many of these kids, they have a 300-word vocabulary. And I don't remember what he said was a reasonable vocabulary, I would guess 8,000 plus words. But imagine if you only have 300 words with which to refer to things, but also with which to consider them in representational consciousness. You see, I have in my own mind many unusual connotations for a tree. First of all, I admit that I don't know what a tree is. That's where I start. I know what the word points at, but I don't know. In other words, I know what the word distinguishes from the world, but I don't know the nature and essence and interiority and presence of the referent unless I enter into participation with it in some way, directly. Unless I enter into relation with it. And of course, there are a few fascinating forms of entering. One is adoration and reverence and honor and respect. One is fascination, deep curiosity, and open-mindedness, so that I can discover things about the tree in relation with it that completely go against everything I was scripted to think about trees, which, by the way, was not much. And even had I become a biologist or an arborist, then still I would have approached the tree from a set perspective of a vocation, right? So I would have acquired the vocations. I would have absorbed many connotations and denotations about the tree and how to tell a healthy tree from an unhealthy one, and what can be done to help a sick tree, and how to prune trees, and perhaps even how to do exotic kinds of pruning. And I have a friend who's an arborist. But when I come at the tree from outside human culture completely, when I just drop everything that human culture has taught me and go to the tree with adoration and reverence, with love, fascination, with respect, then I begin to have the possibility of understanding a tree and trees themselves and plants. And so it is with animals. And so it is with humans and culture and society, even with language. Right? Part of how I learn best is by dropping what I've learned before first, starting from a position of fascinated mystery and proceeding along. So this is a practice we can all play with. We can play with dropping everything I've learned and know. I'll keep the word tree, but I'll forget all the connotation. And I'll find a way to relate with the tree so that we can be together in the world. And if the tree can teach me things, she will. And if the sky can teach me things, she will. But I don't think of whatever's up there as space, except in a very small part of my referential mind. What's up there is mystery, the unknown. The fact that we have names for the lights in the sky does not impress me. No one knows why there are lights in the sky, or why there are minds to wonder. Maybe not no one. Very few people have any kind of intelligent, situation with that. So we can practice unknowing. And that, if we practice unknowing, we will learn what our primary connotation trees are and our denotation trees for the identities that language discerns for us. And I promise you, if you can get just a slightly better idea of what the sun is, all of your other ideas will change. In one very real sense, the sun, there is nothing else here. This is all the sun. Language is the sun. The cars are the sun. The humans are the sun. Matter is the sun. Around here, the sun is primordial in its capacity to originate. But the sun is also in our ideas. You can't really know what the world is if you don't know what the sun is. You can't really know what a vegetable is if you don't know what the sun is. Right now I see the crescent moon. It is setting. The same is true of the moon. If you learn more intelligently, not to know completely, but to get good clues and hints about what dreaming is, you will begin to better understand what having a mind is about. So there are key things like the sun, and dreaming, and a friend, and food. Your hand, your eye. These things, terrifying mysteries, infinitely deep. No one will ever discover the completeness of what they are. But if we can get a slightly better idea than the ones we're being served in our culture, our intelligence will grow and our imagination will flourish. And this is a profound thing to experience, even if it's a little bit dangerous. So I have a couple of ideas on my mind. They come from insights I had when walking with my son the other night. And I'm going to try to state them fairly simply. The first is that we are enculturated to believe that it is reasonable to suppose that an individual human is endowed with the necessary insight and intelligence, the necessary equanimity and balance to make all their decisions by themselves. That's what the idea of an individual is. And our country is dying of this idea right now. And many countries are dying of this idea. And humans have been dying of this idea for a good 1,000 years, if not long before that. But in the last 50, they've been dying of this idea with vastly greater frequency and severity. We do not have a society. We have a cluster of often extremely opinionated, often very poorly educated or narrowly educated individuals and little tiny groups, and they fight with each other all the time. So the insight that I had was, when did it start to become a thing for individuals to make complex decisions alone? Because as we understand it, for nearly all of our evolutionary history, we made decisions together in small, very tightly knit groups that had effectively noble purposes, at least noble at the group level. And some of them were extremely important. They were life and death decisions. And they weren't made by one person. And the person who's injured didn't make all the decisions for themselves. They came to their group and they made decisions together. So when did it become a good idea for individuals to believe and act as though they were perfectly capable of making their own decisions by themselves in matters so complex that even a table of carefully assembled specialists would struggle with the actual degree of ambiguity in any situation, any complex situation? Right now, what's left of our society can't make sense of very simple things. There's no chance of people making sense of complex things by themselves. And if they can't make sense of them, they will kill themselves and each other and the world in all the ways they fail to make sense and make decisions together with and for each other and for the history and future of all beings. But the simple insight was simple. Where did we get the idea that a single human being is capably endowed to decide incredibly complex matters, and why are we stuck in a situation or a vast constellation of them in which this is most of what's going on and it's failing miserably and everybody's pointing fingers at pretty much anything that they can point at. So that was the first insight. And it's a question. But it's also fascinating to me because I never wondered this specific question before. I never really sat down and thought about, if I have a complex situation, even if it's one that I'm an expert in, I'd certainly rather have 3 other experts by my side to walk through it with me, even if I'm really good at it. And that's a very narrow thing. There are a few things I'm really good at. I'd love to have some experts by my side on those things. When we do Tai Chi in the morning, we learn together. We need each other to learn this way. We can't learn this way alone. So we certainly can't practice that way alone. We need each other's bodies. We have to put hands on one another, move things around, test things out, try new things together in an attempt to solve the great mystery of what is Tai Chi. Often the humans look to me like, I don't know, one of the metaphors I have is a bunch of single wings flapping around on the ground, talking feverishly about flight, but never putting 2 of them together and making a bird and going into the sky together with and for each other. Because when we come together, we acquire whole new ways of understanding possibility, potential, threat, risk, reality, goals, urgent imperatives deep within us. We begin to remember what it is to be human only when we come together. A bunch of single wings flapping around on the ground is a nightmare. It's a bad science fiction story. And yet that is the one in which many of us live and to which nearly all of us are subjected, some far more than others. So the second insight, I'm just trying to get through this without taking too long, was that there are peculiar aspects of the left hemisphere that under stress produce something that resembles psychosis or schizophrenia, even though both of those things are poorly defined. And I'm pretty sure it's the conceptual mind, the narratological mind, the linguistic mind, the mind that makes maps of things and descriptions, that becomes thus compelled. And the problem is that the nature of existence is extremely ambiguous. We walk through our lives like people following stones across a river, and we use the familiar stones only. Eventually we become stuck in that we're only capable of using the stones we already know to cross a river in consciousness or understand meaning or possibility, our life path, identity, the nature of our minds, the nature of our lives as beings, as organisms, as animals, as humans, as individuals. So there's an aspect that I'm fairly sure is, left hemispherically inclined or amplified or triggered, where when we're faced with ambiguity in the unknown, this becomes, for most of us, very troubling very quickly. If we're in a complex situation and we can't figure out what's going to happen, there's a certain kind of agitation that arises. If the ambiguity gets extended, I could give examples. Say someone gets cancer and they can't tell whether they're going to live or die. So that's a pretty extreme example. We could take the example of a little while ago my smartphone froze and I wondered, is it broken? And I didn't know. And I couldn't shut it down. So I couldn't tell if it was broken or not. And I felt very concerned about that. I was very anxious and worried. I need my smartphone in the situation I'm in at the moment. So as I became more worried, my consciousness became more narrow. And it became extremely narrow in terms of what it's capable of participating in, thinking about, doing, even in terms of trying to solve the problem. As my anxiety level rose, my consciousness became narrower and narrower. And I began to think about narratives. Well, what if my phone is broken? Blah, blah, blah. What if this happens? What if that happens? And I became very focused on that thinking. And the problem with that is all of that thinking is very uncomfortable. And so we have a tendency as humans and societies and groups of people and families and individuals, we have this inclination that I think we're not aware of, and it's quite profound to consider it. There's an aspect of our mind that rises to dominance in certain kinds of situations, particularly those that are stressful and have high ambiguity, many unknowns. There's a kind of agitation that arises in that, and that agitation funds a particular aspect of consciousness. And that aspect is extremely immature and has a peculiar vulnerability, which is this. In situations of high ambiguity, certain left hemispheric inspired faculties will gladly force the situation into a disaster because a disaster is graspable. If things have totally gone wrong, if I throw my phone into the lake because I think it's broken, now I know I've collapsed the ambiguity. There's no longer a question of whether I will repair my phone or not, or if it's broken or not, or what's going on, or any of that. So we have this tendency, many of us, and it gets enacted in various ways, addiction is one of them, to collapse ambiguity into a kind of disaster or crisis. Or if we can't do that, we can collapse it into spectatorship, right? I'll watch a movie, I'll play the video game, I'll mess with my phone, I'll look at Facebook, whatever. That's a lesser form of collapse. But the real insight I had was just that we are ambiguity averse, generally speaking. And when troubling ambiguity is preserved for any length of time, and things become unknown, and the length of time it will remain unknown becomes unknown, we, many of us, will find ourselves, not consciously, almost compelled, to collapse the situation into a graspable disaster, to wreck something, to cause a crisis. Because once we have that, we can get a grasp on it, and the ambiguity has been evicted. Now I know that, X is not going to become better. Right? Whereas, will it become better or will it become worse? That's troubling. It's much easier to grasp this will not become better. And so we have a tendency to, in disaster or trouble or ambiguity, make more disaster, make trouble, because we can grasp those things. Break the ambience of the unknown, collapse the time, collapse how long things will remain unknown, and all of these features into a graspable crisis of some kind, even if it's a small crisis. The phone's a pretty good example. I'm sure you can think of some yourself, and I hope you will. But just think about how when we're faced with actual mystery and the unknown, it's common for us either to opt out through intoxication or acting out, or just, if we can, make disastrous choices so that the thing collapses from ambiguity into a known disaster. And I thought these two insights were fascinating, and I'm still exploring them. The first, that I don't think as animals we do very well making complex decisions as individuals. And where did that whole idea come from? And the second, under the stress of a lot of ambiguity or uncomfortable unknowns, many of us will feel compelled to produce a crisis because at least we can grasp the crisis, but we cannot grasp the unknown. Of course, we can float in it and take it as it comes and realize, I don't have control. Therefore, I don't have to grip and grasp onto the fear of the unknown. I don't have to produce a crisis. I don't have to grasp anything. We can be gentle. We can loosen that sort of death grip of those tendencies in our consciousness and just relax the hand of our mind around the situation. Almost always this will turn out better. Yeah. Thank you for joining me for now. I look forward to learning together again very soon. I hope that your world is beautiful and filled with wonder and learning and dreams and growth and safety. Bye-bye for now.